In the heart of Baltimore, Leonard Harper, a quiet Vietnam veteran with a weathered cane and a world of untold stories, finds himself on an unexpected journey of change and redemption. What begins as a simple ride on a crowded city bus quickly spirals into something much greater. Confronted by a group of unruly teenagers, Leonard's calm yet powerful response sets off a series of events that will ripple through not only his life, but also the lives of those around him. From an overdue promise to an old comrade to the quiet transformation of troubled youth, Leonard discovers that even the smallest acts of kindness can create profound change. Along the way, he forms unlikely connections with a determined single mother, a boy searching for his place, and a community in need of hope. But Leonard's story is not just about helping others. It's about confronting his own past, embracing second chances, and finding meaning in a life he once thought had little left to offer. What will Leonard uncover about himself? And how will his journey reshape the lives of those who cross his path? Step into this heartfelt story of resilience, compassion, and the enduring power of human connection. Baltimore's early evening sky hung heavy with the promise of rain. The city streets bustled with the usual rhythm of commuters heading home. Leonard Harper boarded the 5:15 bus, his cane tapping lightly against the steps. The driver, a young man who barely glanced up, gestured him in without a word. Leonard nodded his thanks, easing himself into a seat near the front. His movements were deliberate, each step mindful of the aches that lingered in his joints. The bus smelled faintly of exhaust and the sweat of its passengers. It was packed as usual, a medley of voices blending with the occasional screech of brakes. Leonard adjusted his grip on his cane, its polished wood smooth under his weathered fingers. The cane was more than just a walking aid. It was a remnant of a life that had been anything but easy. Leonard wore a simple outfit, a brown jacket patched at the elbows and slacks that hung loosely on his wiry frame. His shoes, polished but scuffed at the toes, hinted at someone who cared about appearances despite having little to spare. He rested his hands on the head of his cane, staring out the window as the city blurred past. At 74, Leonard had learned the art of blending in. His face bore deep lines, carved by years of hardship and the weight of memories he rarely spoke about. His eyes, a sharp gray, missed nothing, though he often chose to let the world pass by without engaging. 3 rows back, a group of teenagers boarded, their laughter sharp and piercing. They swaggered onto the bus, scanning the passengers like a pack of restless wolves. One boy, tall and lanky with a bright red hoodie, locked eyes on Leonard. His smirk spread slowly, an expression brimming with mischief. "Hey, old man," the boy called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the hum of the bus. "You lose your walker or something?" A ripple of unease passed through the bus. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to hear, others casting wary glances toward the boys. Leonard remained still, his gaze fixed on the world outside. If he heard the boy, he gave no sign. The boy in the hoodie took the silence as an invitation to escalate. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue?" He stood, his friends chuckling behind him. The boy swayed slightly as the bus jolted over a pothole, but his smirk never wavered. Leonard's fingers tightened around his cane, a barely perceptible movement. His face betrayed nothing, though a faint crease appeared between his brows. Slowly, he turned his head to meet the boy's gaze. His expression was calm, unyielding. "You think strength is loud, don't you?" Leonard said, his voice low but firm. "You have no idea what strength looks like." The boy hesitated, caught off guard by the response. For a moment, he seemed unsure, but his pride forced him to push further. "Oh yeah?" the boy sneered. "Why don't you show us, old man?" Leonard sighed, a long measured exhale. He straightened slightly, his cane steady between his knees. The tension in the bus was palpable, every passenger now silently observing the unfolding confrontation. "Strength," Leonard said, his voice steady. is knowing when to act and when to hold back. It is not about proving yourself to anyone. It is about standing firm in who you are. The boy blinked, his bravado faltering. Behind him, his friends exchanged uneasy glances. The other passengers seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Leonard leaned back in his seat, his gaze unwavering. "You remind me of someone I used to know. A young soldier who thought he was untouchable. War taught him otherwise." The boy's smirk disappeared entirely. He shuffled his feet, looking away. The laughter from his friends had faded into awkward silence. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman glanced at Leonard, her eyes wide with a mix of respect and curiosity. A man in a gray suit adjusted his tie, his discomfort evident. The bus lurched to a stop at a red light, the sudden jolt breaking the tension. Leonard turned his attention back to the window, his grip on the cane loosening. The boy muttered something under his breath before retreating to his seat. His friends followed, their bravado shattered. The passengers began to relax, the atmosphere on the bus shifting from tension to quiet reflection. Leonard closed his eyes briefly, letting the moment pass. He did not feel triumph or anger, only a deep, lingering weariness. Confrontations like these were not new to him. They reminded him of his youth, of the fire he once carried, and the lessons that had tempered it. As the bus rolled on, Leonard thought about the boy in the red hoodie. He saw something familiar in him, a recklessness born of inexperience, a desire to prove oneself without understanding the cost. Leonard hoped the boy would remember this moment, that it might plant a seed of reflection. The bus neared Leonard's stop. He tapped his cane lightly against the floor before rising, his movements deliberate. As he stepped off the bus, the cool evening air greeted him. The sky had darkened, but the rain had yet to fall. Leonard walked slowly toward his small apartment, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the pavement. The streets were quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. His apartment was modest, a one-bedroom unit in a building that had seen better days. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, and the furniture was functional but worn. On the mantel, a single photo stood in a simple wooden frame. It showed a younger Leonard in uniform, his arm around a fellow soldier. Leonard set his cane against the wall and lowered himself into an armchair. He stared at the photo, memories of Vietnam flooding back. The faces of his comrades, their laughter during rare moments of respite, their courage in the face of unthinkable odds. Some had not made it home. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The day's events played over in his mind, and he felt a pang of regret. He had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, reluctant to let anyone see the depth of his scars. But something about that boy in the red hoodie lingered in his thoughts. Perhaps it was the recognition of his younger self, the echoes of mistakes he had once made. Leonard resolved to do more than just endure. He had learned the value of kindness, the power of small gestures to change a life. Tomorrow he would visit the community center down the block. Perhaps there was a way to share his story, to guide someone like that boy toward a different path. The thought brought a faint smile to Leonard's lips. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, their rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in his mind. For the first time in a long while, Leonard felt a flicker of purpose. The world was not as unkind as it often seemed, and neither was he. Leonard woke to the steady patter of rain against his apartment window. The city outside was cloaked in gray, the streets slick with water. He reached for his cane, its familiar weight grounding him, and made his way to the small kitchen. A pot of coffee brewed quietly as he stood at the counter, staring out at the world beyond the glass. The night before lingered in his mind, the boy in the red hoodie, the tension on the bus, the silence that followed his words. Leonard hoped the boy had taken something meaningful from the exchange. He sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through him, and turned the idea over in his mind. The community center. By mid-morning, Leonard was out the door, his cane tapping steadily on the sidewalk. The rain had eased to a light drizzle. He walked past familiar landmarks, a laundromat with its humming machines visible through the window, a corner store where the owner always nodded politely. Life went on as it always did, but Leonard felt something stirring inside him. A few blocks away, the scent of fresh bread and coffee drew him to a small diner. Its neon sign blinked unevenly, and the paint on the door was chipped, but the warmth inside was inviting. Leonard stepped in, shaking droplets from his jacket. The waitress behind the counter greeted him with a smile. She was young, mid-30s at most, with auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her name tag read Emily. "Take a seat anywhere, sir," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been on her feet all morning. Leonard chose a booth by the window, the vinyl seat creaking slightly as he sat down. Emily approached with a menu, but Leonard shook his head. "Just coffee, please." Emily nodded and disappeared behind the counter. Leonard watched her move, noticing the small details, a slight limp in her step, the tired set of her shoulders. She returned moments later with a steaming cup of coffee. "Here you go," she said, placing it gently in front of him. "Refills are on me today." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "On you? That's generous." Emily shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You remind me of my grandfather. He used to come here every Sunday for pancakes before he passed." She hesitated, then added, "He was in Vietnam too." Leonard's grip on his cane tightened slightly. "Is that so?" Emily nodded, her smile faltering for a moment. "Yeah, he didn't talk about it much, but he had that same quiet strength, like you." Leonard didn't reply immediately. He looked down at the coffee, its surface swirling faintly. "Your grandfather sounds like a good man," he said finally. Emily's smile returned, softer this time. "He was." The moment passed, and Emily returned to her work. Leonard sipped his coffee, his thoughts drifting. He hadn't expected such kindness from a stranger, least of all in a place like this. The world could be harsh, but moments like these reminded him of its gentler side. After a while, Emily returned with a slice of apple pie on a small plate. She set it down without a word. "I didn't order this," Leonard said, though he made no move to push it away. "It's on the house," Emily replied, her tone firm but kind. "You look like you could use something sweet today." Leonard chuckled softly. "Thank you." As he ate, he noticed a boy seated at the counter, fidgeting with a fork. The boy was maybe 15, his clothes slightly too big, his sneakers scuffed. He seemed to be waiting for someone who wasn't coming. When Emily passed by, Leonard gestured toward the boy. "He yours?" Emily shook her head. "No, that's Caleb. He comes in sometimes when he's having a rough day. I think he lives with his aunt, but—" She trailed off, her expression pained. Leonard nodded. He recognized the look in the boy's eyes, restless, searching, a mix of defiance and vulnerability. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror as a young man, and again in the soldiers he had fought alongside. When Leonard finished his pie, he left a few bills on the table and paused at the counter on his way out. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "Any time," she replied, her smile reaching her eyes. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. Leonard walked back toward his apartment, the boy at the diner lingering in his thoughts. Caleb reminded him of the teenagers on the bus, of the boy in the red hoodie. He thought about how easy it was for young people to lose their way when the world seemed to offer little guidance. Later that afternoon, Leonard found himself at the community center. It was a modest building with peeling paint, but it buzzed with activity. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the sound of children laughing and playing. The receptionist, a cheerful woman named Dana, greeted him with a bright smile. "How can I help you today?" "I'm here to volunteer," Leonard said, surprised at how natural the words felt. Dana's smile widened. "That's wonderful. Do you have any specific skills or interests? I used to tutor kids in math a long time ago, Leonard replied. And I have some experience with life lessons. Dana chuckled. I think we could use both. Let me show you around. She led him to a classroom where a small group of children were working on homework. A young volunteer was helping them, but she looked overwhelmed. Dana introduced Leonard and handed him a stack of worksheets. Let me know if you need anything, Dana said, before leaving. Leonard took a seat at the head of the table. The children eyed him warily at first, but his calm demeanor soon put them at ease. He guided them through math problems, offering gentle encouragement. By the time the session ended, Leonard felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. As he packed up, Dana approached him. You're a natural, she said. The kids loved you. Leonard smiled faintly. It felt good to help. On his way out, he passed by the recreation area and spotted Caleb sitting alone, his head bent over a book. Leonard paused, debating whether to approach. Before he could decide, Caleb looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Leonard gave a slight nod and continued on his way. That night, as Leonard sat in his apartment, he thought about the day's events. Emily's kindness, Caleb's quiet presence, and the children's eager faces all left a mark on him. The world, he realized, was full of small moments that could change everything. And perhaps, if he allowed himself, he could be part of that change. The sun broke through a thin veil of clouds the next morning, bathing Baltimore in a tentative warmth. Leonard made his way back to the community center, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the sidewalk. He hadn't planned on returning so soon, but the memory of the children's eager faces and Caleb's solitary figure had drawn him back. Inside, the center hummed with activity. Volunteers bustled about, children chattered over board games, and the faint squeak of sneakers echoed from the gymnasium. Leonard approached the front desk, where Dana greeted him with a smile. Good to see you again, Mr. Harper, she said. Just Leonard, he corrected gently. Dana chuckled. All right, Leonard, ready for another round with the kids? Leonard nodded. That, and maybe something else. There's a boy here, Caleb. I saw him yesterday. Is he part of any programs? Dana's smile faltered slightly. Caleb? He's a tough one. Comes in and out. He's on probation, but we're trying to keep him engaged. He likes art, but he doesn't talk. Leonard absorbed the inspiration, his mind turning over possibilities. I'd like to with him if he's willing. Not surprised, but I'll talk to him. He's in the rec room now. For today, let's start with the tutoring session. Leonard spent the next hour helping a group of middle schoolers with their math homework. Their questions were a mix of timid curiosity and playful challenges, but Leonard met each one with patience. As the session ended, Dana approached him, a hesitant smile on her face. I mentioned it to Caleb. He's skeptical, but he said he'll think about it. Leonard smiled faintly. That's a start. Later that afternoon, Leonard wandered into the recreation area. It was a large, open room filled with mismatched furniture, art supplies, and a well-worn ping-pong table. Caleb was there, seated at a corner table with a sketch pad. His head was bent low, the pencil in his hand moving in quick, confident strokes. Leonard didn't approach immediately. Instead, he observed from a distance, noting the intensity with which Caleb worked. The boy seemed lost in his own world, the rest of the room fading away. After a while, Leonard cleared his throat gently. Caleb's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing. Mind if I sit? Leonard asked, gesturing to the chair across from him. Caleb shrugged, his expression guarded. It's a free country. Leonard sat down, resting his cane against the edge of the table. He nodded toward the sketch pad. What are you working on? Caleb hesitated before flipping the pad toward Leonard. It was a detailed drawing of a cityscape. the buildings rendered with sharp precision. The lines were clean, deliberate, and full of life. "This is good," Leonard said sincerely. Caleb's eyes flicked to Leonard's face, searching for signs of mockery, but found none. He shrugged again. "It's just something I do." "You've got a talent," Leonard continued. "Where'd you learn to draw like this?" Caleb hesitated, then muttered, "Just taught myself. Nobody else to teach me." Leonard nodded, understanding the subtext. "Self-taught can take you far. You ever think about doing something more with it?" Caleb's expression turned wary. "Like what? I'm just some kid on probation. Nobody cares about what I can do." Leonard leaned forward slightly. "That's where you're wrong. People care more than you think, and you've got something special here. Don't waste it." The boy's face softened, but only for a moment. "Why do you care?" Leonard's grip on his cane tightened briefly. "Because I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel like the world's against you, and I know what it's like to waste potential." Caleb looked away, his jaw tightening. "I messed up, got caught with the wrong crowd. Now, everywhere I go, people look at me like I'm just some delinquent." Leonard's voice was calm, steady. "A mistake doesn't define you. What you do next does." For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the center filled the silence between them. Finally, Caleb nodded, almost imperceptibly. "You coming back tomorrow?" he asked, his tone begrudging but curious. Leonard smiled faintly. "If you'll be here, I will." Caleb didn't respond directly, but the slight relaxation in his posture spoke volumes. That evening, Leonard returned to his apartment, his mind full of the day's events. He sat at his small dining table, the photo of his younger self catching his eye. The man in the picture looked confident, almost invincible, a stark contrast to the man he had become. But Leonard no longer saw that as a bad thing. The years had humbled him, given him perspective. And now, it seemed, they had given him a new purpose. He thought about Caleb, about the spark he had seen in the boy, despite the layers of defiance and hurt. Leonard had always believed in the power of second chances. Maybe this was his chance to pass that belief on to someone else. The rain started again, tapping softly against the window. Leonard leaned back in his chair, letting the rhythm soothe him. Tomorrow, he thought, was another opportunity to connect, to guide, to show someone that their worth went far beyond their mistakes. For the first time in years, Leonard felt a quiet sense of anticipation. The next morning, Leonard arrived at the community center with the same deliberate pace. The autumn air was crisp, and the sound of children playing in the nearby park carried on the breeze. Leonard felt a small pang of regret as he passed by a distant echo of the simpler joys he'd left behind decades ago. Inside the center, the atmosphere buzzed with its usual energy. Dana waved at him from the front desk. "You've already made an impression, Leonard. Caleb's been asking about you since he got here." Leonard nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He made his way to the recreation room, where Caleb sat at the same table as yesterday, his sketchpad open. But as Leonard approached, he noticed another figure nearby, a lanky boy in a red hoodie, sitting stiffly with his hands in his lap. Leonard's steps slowed, recognition dawning. It was the boy from the bus. Ethan glanced up and met Leonard's eyes. His face turned red, and he quickly looked away. Caleb, oblivious to the tension, continued sketching. "Morning, Caleb," Leonard said, his voice steady. He turned to Ethan. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Ethan fidgeted with the frayed edge of his hoodie. I just—" He stopped, clearly struggling for words. Caleb looked up, his brow furrowing. "You two know each other?" Leonard nodded. "We've crossed paths before." He pulled out a chair and sat down, resting his cane against the table. His calm demeanor seemed to unsettle Ethan, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Ethan blurted out, his words tumbling over each other. "For what I said on the bus. It was It was wrong. I shouldn't have done it. The room seemed to grow quieter, the weight of Ethan's admission hanging in the air. Caleb stared at him, his pencil hovering mid-air. Leonard studied Ethan for a long moment before speaking. "Apology accepted," Leonard said simply. His voice carried no judgment, only sincerity. Ethan looked up, relief flickering across his face. But Leonard wasn't finished. "Do you know why your words mattered?" Leonard asked. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "Because words have weight," Leonard continued, "more than you realize. They can tear someone down or build them up. What you said wasn't just about me. It was about what you chose to put into the world." Ethan nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Leonard's words. "You have a choice," Leonard said. "Every day, you decide who you want to be. And that choice isn't always easy, but it's yours to make." Caleb set his pencil down, his gaze bouncing between Leonard and Ethan. The usual sharpness in his expression had softened, replaced by something closer to curiosity. "You gonna stick around?" Caleb asked Ethan, his tone challenging, but not unkind. Ethan shrugged, his hands still fidgeting. "I guess, if that's okay." Caleb hair crossing his arm. "Well, if you're gonna hang out, don't just sit there. Grab a sketch pad or something." Ethan blinked, surprised by the invitation. Leonard couldn't help but smile. "I'll leave you two to it," Leonard said, rising slowly. "I'll be in the tutoring room if you need me." As he walked away, he glanced back to see Ethan awkwardly picking up a pencil while Caleb muttered instructions. It was a small moment, but one that carried a glimmer of hope. In the tutoring room, Leonard spent the next hour helping a group of younger kids with their reading. The steady rhythm of the session helped settle his thoughts, but Ethan's sudden appearance lingered in his mind. When the session ended, Leonard lingered near the front desk, chatting briefly with Dana. As they spoke, Ethan appeared in the doorway, looking hesitant. "Mr. Harper," Ethan said, his voice quieter than before. "Just Leonard," he corrected gently. Ethan nodded and stepped closer. "I wanted to ask, how do you do it? Stay so calm, I mean, even when people are not great to you." Leonard considered the question, his eyes narrowing slightly as he searched for the right words. "It wasn't always this way," he admitted. "There was a time when anger came easy to me. But I learned something during the war. Anger burns fast, but it doesn't build anything. Calm is harder, but it lets you see clearly. It gives you control over your choices." Ethan absorbed the answer, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I've been making a lot of bad choices lately." "Bad choices don't have to define you," Leonard said. "What matters is what you do next, and it seems like you've already started turning things around." Ethan looked down, his face tinged with both shame and hope. I want to do better. Be better." Leonard placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then you're on the right path. Keep walking it." By the time Leonard left the center that afternoon, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Ethan's apology and willingness to change reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten: the power of second chances. As he walked back to his apartment, the streets seemed a little brighter. The faint scent of rain lingered in the air, and the distant sound of children laughing brought a small smile to his face. Inside his apartment, Leonard sat at his small dining table, the photograph of his younger self catching his eye once again. He thought about the men he had fought alongside in Vietnam, the camaraderie they'd shared, and the sacrifices they'd made. He reached for a notebook he kept in a drawer and began to write. Not about the war, but about the moments that mattered, the connections he was beginning to forge at the center, the sparks of hope he saw in Caleb and Ethan. For the first time in years, Leonard felt like his story wasn't just about survival. It was about purpose, about passing on the lessons he had learned the hard way. As the sun set over Baltimore, casting the city in a warm, golden glow, Leonard closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. The journey wasn't over, but it was moving in a direction he hadn't anticipated. And for that, he was grateful. The days at the community center became a rhythm Leonard welcomed. Each morning, he walked the familiar path, passing the corner diner where Emily would wave at him from behind the counter. At the center, he worked with the children, offered quiet guidance to Caleb, and checked in on Ethan, who was slowly finding his place among the other volunteers. But one evening, as Leonard sat at his small dining table, his thoughts turned to a part of his life he rarely let himself revisit. His gaze lingered on the old photograph that stood on the mantel himself as a young soldier, arms slung around his comrade, Henry Lewis. Leonard's chest tightened as memories of Vietnam surfaced. Henry had been more than a friend. He'd been like a brother. They had shared everything, from laughter during quiet nights in the jungle to whispered fears before missions. Henry's death in an ambush was a wound that never fully healed. Leonard stared at the photo, a weight pressing on him. He had promised Henry something, a simple task that, in the chaos of returning home and rebuilding his life, he had forgotten. He stood slowly, cane in hand, and made his way to the attic, where dusty boxes sat untouched. It took him nearly an hour to find it, buried beneath old uniforms and yellowed papers. A letter, its envelope worn and creased. Henry had written it for his family just days before he was killed, asking Leonard to deliver it if he didn't make it back. Leonard sat on the edge of the attic floor, the letter trembling in his hands. He had failed Henry in this one last duty, and the realization filled him with regret. The next morning, Leonard walked into the community center with the letter tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. He carried it not as a burden, but as a reminder of the task he had to fulfill. Dana greeted him with her usual warm smile. "Good morning, Leonard. You look thoughtful today." Leonard hesitated, then nodded. "I found something yesterday, a letter from an old friend. I was supposed to deliver it years ago, but—" His voice trailed off, and he shook his head. "I never did." Dana tilted her head. "Are you going to deliver it now?" "I think I have to," Leonard said quietly. Dana's smile softened. "It's never too late to do the right thing." Later that day, Leonard stopped by the diner. Emily placed his usual coffee in front of him and raised an eyebrow at the solemn look on his face. "Something on your mind?" she asked. Leonard pulled the letter from his pocket, setting it on the table between them. It's for the family of a friend I lost in the war. I should have given it to them years ago, but I didn't. Now I don't even know where to start." Emily sat down across from him, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's stopping you?" Leonard sighed. "Guilt, maybe, or fear. It's been so long, what if they don't want to hear from me?" Emily's gaze was steady. "You made a promise, didn't you?" "I did," Leonard admitted. "Then keep it," Emily said simply. "You'll regret it more if you don't." Her words struck a chord. Leonard nodded, folding the letter carefully. "I'll need to do some digging to find them," he said. "I can help," Emily offered. Leonard hesitated, but her sincerity was undeniable. "Thank you," he said. Over the next few days, Leonard and Emily worked together to track down Henry's family. The search led them through old addresses, online records, and phone calls. It was tedious, but Emily's persistence kept Leonard moving forward. During one of their breaks, Emily shared more of her own story. "My grandfather used to say that every day was a chance to set things right," she said, refilling Leonard's coffee. "He believed in second chances. I guess I got that from him." Her words stayed with Leonard. The parallels between her grandfather and himself were uncanny, and her kindness reminded him of the camaraderie he'd shared with Henry. Finally, they found a lead. Henry's younger sister, Martha, who now lived a few hours away in a small town in Pennsylvania. Leonard stared at the address for a long moment before speaking. "I'll go," he said. Emily nodded. "You're doing the right thing." Leonard's journey to Pennsylvania was quiet and contemplative. The bus ride gave him time to reflect on his years of silence, the memories he had buried, and the promise he was finally keeping. The letter felt heavy in his pocket, but it was no longer a burden. It was a connection, a bridge to a part of his life that deserved closure. When the bus arrived in the small town, Leonard's nerves began to fray. What would he say? Would Martha even remember him? He took a deep breath, gripping his cane tightly as he made his way to the modest house at the end of a quiet street. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s, her gray hair neatly styled. Her eyes widened as she took in Leonard's face. "Leonard Harper?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Yes," Leonard said. "You must be Martha." She nodded, tears already welling in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see you again." "I'm sorry it's taken me so long to come," Leonard said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled the letter from his pocket and held it out to her. "This is from Henry. He wrote it for you, just before—" Martha took the letter with shaking hands, her breath hitching as she held it close. She invited Leonard inside, and they sat together in the living room, surrounded by photos of Henry and their family. As Martha read the letter, tears streamed down her face. She looked up at Leonard, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for bringing this to me. It means more than you can imagine." "I should have done it sooner," Leonard said, his voice breaking. Martha reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "Henry would be proud of you, and so am I." The hours they spent together were filled with stories, laughter, and shared memories of Henry. For the first time in years, Leonard felt a sense of peace, as if a part of his heart had been mended. As he boarded the bus back to Baltimore, Leonard looked out the window, the weight of guilt finally lifting from his shoulders. He had kept his promise, and in doing so, he had rediscovered a piece of himself he thought was lost. The bus hummed steadily along the highway, carrying Leonard back to Baltimore as the sun dipped low in the sky. He sat by the window, watching the countryside give way to sprawling suburbs and, eventually, the familiar city skyline. The letter he had delivered to Martha still weighed on his mind, though the weight now was a gentle one, a kind of closure he hadn't realized he needed. For the first time in years, Leonard allowed himself to think about Henry freely, without the guilt that had shadowed those memories. Their shared laughter, the camaraderie forged in the fire of war, and the quiet moments of mutual understanding were no longer painful to recall. Instead, they felt like treasures, something to hold close. The bus stopped at a busy terminal in downtown Baltimore. Leonard stepped off, gripping his cane tightly as he navigated the bustling crowd. As he made his way home, he couldn't help but notice the subtle kindness in the world around him. A young man helping an elderly woman with her bags, a street musician playing softly as passers-by dropped coins into his case, a little girl offering her last piece of candy to her brother. The echoes of these small gestures followed Leonard all the way to his apartment, where he settled into his armchair. He stared at the old photograph on the mantel, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That night, Leonard slept deeply, undisturbed by the nightmares that had often haunted him. The next morning, Leonard returned to the community center. As he entered, Dana greeted him warmly. "How was your trip?" she asked. Leonard nodded. "It was important. Something I needed to do." Dana's smile widened. "Well, you've been missed. Caleb's been asking about you non-stop." Leonard chuckled softly. "Then I suppose I'd better find him." He made his way to the recreation room, where Caleb was hunched over his sketchpad, engrossed in his work. Ethan sat nearby, doodling aimlessly but clearly enjoying the atmosphere. "Look who decided to come back," Caleb said without looking up. "Miss me, did you?" Leonard teased, taking a seat across from him. "Not really," Caleb replied, though the slight smile on his face gave him away. Ethan glanced up from his doodles. "You were gone for a while. Where'd you go?" Leonard hesitated, considering how much to share. I went to visit an old friend's family. Delivered something I should have given them years ago. Caleb's pencil paused mid-stroke. Why'd you wait so long? Leonard met his gaze, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes it's easier to carry guilt than to face it. But I learned something on that trip. It's never too late to set things right. Caleb nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. As the day went on, Leonard noticed a shift in Ethan and Caleb. The two boys, once so wary of each other, were beginning to form a tentative bond. Caleb, who usually kept his guard up, offered Ethan tips on drawing. Ethan, in turn, shared a bit of his humor, coaxing reluctant laughs from Caleb. Leonard watched from a distance, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He had planted a seed in both of them, and now he was seeing it take root. Later that afternoon, Emily stopped by the center, carrying a bag of sandwiches for the volunteers. Leonard was surprised but pleased to see her. "Thought you could use a break," she said, handing him a sandwich. "You didn't have to do this," Leonard said, though he accepted the offering gratefully. Emily shrugged. "You've been helping a lot of people lately. It's only fair someone helps you, too." As they sat together in the break room, Emily asked about his trip. Leonard shared the story of delivering Henry's letter, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It wasn't just about keeping a promise," he admitted. "It was about reconnecting with a part of myself I thought was gone." Emily nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "Sometimes we lose pieces of ourselves along the way, but those pieces aren't gone forever. We just have to find them again." Her words resonated deeply with Leonard. He thought about the life he had built after the war, the struggles, the isolation, and now, the unexpected joy of being part of something larger than himself. That evening, as Leonard walked home, he stopped by the diner. It had become a second home of sorts, a place where Emily's warmth and the hum of ordinary life offered him comfort. The air inside was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. A young couple laughed softly in a corner booth, and a man in a suit read the newspaper at the counter. Leonard took a seat, and Emily appeared moments later with a fresh cup of coffee. "You're becoming a regular," she said with a grin. "Maybe I like the company," Leonard replied, his tone light. Emily sat down briefly, her apron folded neatly in her lap. "I meant what I said earlier, you know, about finding pieces of yourself." Leonard nodded. "It's been a long time since I felt like I was part of something. The center, the people I've met, it's given me a reason to keep moving forward." Emily's smile was gentle. "You're doing good, Leonard. And not just for them, for yourself, too." As Leonard sipped his coffee, he felt the truth of her words settle in his chest. The journey he had started wasn't just about helping others. It was about healing himself. That night, back in his apartment, Leonard opened his notebook and began to write, not just about the past, but about the present, the connections he was building, the lessons he was learning, and the hope he was beginning to feel. Each word felt like a step forward, a reminder that his story was far from over. The days following Leonard's trip to Pennsylvania felt lighter, as if the burden he had carried for decades had finally begun to lift. He continued his work at the community center, finding purpose in the routines he had come to cherish. Yet, despite the progress he saw in Ethan and Caleb, his mind often wandered back to Martha and the warmth of her home. One Friday evening, after finishing his shift at the center, Leonard sat at his dining table, staring at the address Martha had given him. During his visit, she had invited him to return any time, but Leonard hesitated. Though he had delivered Henry's letter, he wondered if his presence might stir more pain than comfort. The next morning, Leonard decided. He packed a small bag, took his notebook, and boarded a bus back to Pennsylvania. The ride was familiar now, and Leonard found himself looking forward to the small town's quiet charm. When he arrived, the streets were lively with weekend activity. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from a park down the street. Leonard approached Martha's house, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. This time, his nerves were less pronounced, replaced by a quiet anticipation. Martha opened the door almost immediately, her expression lighting up with recognition. "Leonard," she said warmly, stepping aside to let him in. Inside, the living room was just as he remembered, cozy and filled with photographs of Henry and their family. On the coffee table sat a framed copy of Henry's letter, preserved under glass. "I wasn't expecting you," Martha said, gesturing for him to sit. "I wasn't sure I'd come back," Leonard admitted, settling into a worn armchair. "But I've been thinking about what you said, about Henry being proud." Martha smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "He would be, Leonard. You meant the world to him." They spent the next hour sharing stories. Leonard spoke of the nights he and Henry would keep watch, passing the time by talking about their dreams for the future. Martha shared memories of Henry as a boy, his boundless energy, his knack for fixing things, and his fierce loyalty to the people he loved. For the first time in years, Leonard felt as though he was truly honoring Henry's memory. As the afternoon stretched on, Martha surprised Leonard by inviting him to a family dinner. "My daughter and her kids are coming over tonight," she explained. "I think they'd like to meet you." Leonard hesitated. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude." Martha shook her head. "You're not intruding. You're family, Leonard. At least, that's how Henry would have seen it." The word family struck a chord deep within Leonard. It had been so long since he felt part of one. He nodded, his voice quiet. "Thank you." That evening, the house filled with the warm aroma of baked chicken, roasted vegetables, and freshly baked rolls. Martha's daughter, Susan, greeted Leonard with a wide smile, introducing her two children, Tommy, a curious 8-year-old, and Grace, a shy but sweet 10-year-old. At first, Leonard felt out of place. He wasn't used to the noise, the chatter, or the casual chaos of a family dinner. But as the meal went on, he found himself laughing at Tommy's endless questions and smiling at Grace's quiet observations. Susan leaned over at one point, speaking softly so the children wouldn't hear. "My mom told me about the letter, what you did for her, for us. Thank you." Leonard's throat tightened. "It was the least I could do," he said simply. After dinner, Tommy insisted on showing Leonard his collection of toy soldiers. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Leonard found himself sharing stories of his time in the army, carefully choosing the parts that would inspire wonder without revealing the darker truths. As the evening wore on, Leonard felt a sense of belonging that had been absent from his life for far too long. When Leonard returned to Baltimore the next day, his heart was full. The visit with Martha and her family had reminded him of something he had forgotten: how it felt to be connected, to be seen and valued for more than the scars he carried. At the community center, Caleb noticed the change almost immediately. "You seem different," the boy said, his pencil scratching against the paper as he sketched. Leonard chuckled. "Different good or different bad?" Caleb shrugged. "I don't know. Just lighter." Leonard considered the observation, then nodded. "Maybe I am." Ethan, who had been quietly drawing nearby, chimed in. "So, what was it like, seeing them again?" Leonard smiled, his gaze distant. "It was like finding something you didn't realize you'd lost. It reminded me that no matter how much time passes, it's never too late to reconnect." The boys fell quiet, their expressions thoughtful. Leonard didn't press further, knowing the lesson would take root in its own time. That evening, Leonard stopped by the diner, where Emily greeted him with her usual bright smile. "You've been busy," she said, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "I suppose I have," Leonard replied. Emily leaned on the counter, her eyes curious. "So, what's next for you?" Leonard considered the question, his fingers tracing the edge of the cup. "I don't know," he admitted. but I feel like I'm moving in the right direction, and for now, that's enough. Emily's smile softened. Sometimes, that's all we need to keep moving forward. As Leonard walked home that night, the city felt different to him. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but Leonard himself was not the man he had been. He had rediscovered the power of connection, of keeping promises, and of opening his heart to the kindness of others. And for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The days seemed to flow more easily for Leonard now. Each morning, he rose with a sense of purpose, eager to see what the day would bring at the community center. The weight of his past, once a constant companion, had eased into a quieter presence, a reminder, not a burden. At the center, the changes in Caleb and Ethan were unmistakable. Caleb, once closed off and defensive, had grown more confident, his natural talent for art shining through. Ethan, who had started as a reluctant participant, now actively helped with the younger children, his humor and patience making him a favorite among the kids. One afternoon, as Leonard sat in the recreation room, Caleb approached him, sketchpad in hand. "Hey, Mr. Harper," Caleb said, his tone unusually formal. "Just Leonard," he corrected gently, setting aside the book he had been reading. Caleb held out the sketchpad. I made this. For you." Leonard took the pad, his brow furrowing as he studied the drawing. It was a portrait of him, rendered in crisp pencil strokes. The detail was astonishing, the lines of his face, the steady grip on his cane, even the faint glint in his eyes. "This is incredible," Leonard said, his voice thick with emotion. Caleb shifted awkwardly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's nothing special. Just thought you might like it." "Caleb," Leonard said firmly, "this is more than special. It's a gift. Thank you." The boy glanced up, a flicker of pride in his expression. "You're welcome." Ethan, who had been nearby organizing art supplies, leaned over to look at the drawing. "Man, that's good," he said. "You should put that in an art show or something." Caleb snorted. "Yeah, right." "Why not?" Leonard interjected. "You've got real talent, Caleb. You should share it." Caleb shrugged, though the idea clearly intrigued him. The next day, Leonard spoke with Dana about Caleb's talent. "I've been thinking," Leonard said. "Caleb's work deserves to be seen. Maybe we could organize a small exhibit here at the center, something to showcase what the kids are capable of." Dana's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, Leonard. It could be a great way to boost their confidence and show the community what we're doing here." They began planning immediately, enlisting volunteers to help organize the event. Ethan threw himself into the preparations, helping Caleb choose his best pieces and setting up the space. As the day of the exhibit approached, Leonard noticed a change in Caleb. The boy who once carried himself with a chip on his shoulder now walked with a quiet determination, his confidence growing with each passing day. The exhibit was a modest affair, held in the center's main hall. Parents, neighbors, and local community members filled the room, admiring the children's artwork displayed on easels and tables. Caleb's section drew particular attention, his intricate drawings of cityscapes and portraits standing out. Leonard watched from the sidelines, a sense of pride swelling in his chest as he saw Caleb explain his work to a small group of visitors. "That's my student," Leonard said quietly to Ethan, who stood beside him. Ethan grinned. "You've done good, Leonard. You really have." Leonard chuckled. "It's not just me. You've done your part too." Ethan's expression turned thoughtful. "Maybe, but you started it. You showed me, I don't know, that people can change." Leonard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You changed because you wanted to. All I did was remind you that it's possible." Ethan nodded, a quiet determination in his eyes. The success of the exhibit rippled through the community. Parents who had never visited the center before expressed interest in enrolling their children. Donations increased, allowing Dana to expand programs and hire more staff. For Leonard, The event marked more than just a milestone for the center. It was proof of the power of small acts of kindness, how they could grow into something far greater than anyone expected. One evening, as Leonard walked home, Caleb ran up behind him, breathless but smiling. "Wait up, Leonard," the boy called, skidding to a stop beside him. "What's on your mind, Caleb?" Leonard asked, his pace slowing. I just, I wanted to say thanks," Caleb said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "For everything. You didn't have to care, but you did. And it made a difference." Leonard stopped, leaning on his cane as he turned to face the boy. "Caleb, you had that strength in you all along. All I did was help you see it." The boy nodded, his eyes glistening. "Still, thanks," Leonard smiled, patting Caleb on the shoulder. "Keep moving forward, Caleb. You're going to do great things." That night, back in his apartment, Leonard sat at his table with his notebook. He began to write, capturing the events of the past few weeks in careful, deliberate words. The entries weren't just about the center or the boys, they were about hope, resilience, and the lessons he had learned through the lives he had touched. As the city settled into quiet, Leonard closed his notebook and looked out the window. The lights of Baltimore twinkled against the dark sky, each one a reminder of the lives that continued to shine, even in the face of hardship. Leonard had started this journey with a single act of kindness. Now, he saw the ripples of that act spreading far beyond what he could have imagined. And for the first time, he truly believed in the power of change, not just for others, but for himself. The weeks following the art exhibit brought new energy to the community center. Parents were visiting more often, volunteers were stepping up, and the children were brimming with excitement. Dana had even received calls from local businesses offering to support the center with donations and resources. For Leonard, the transformation was deeply gratifying. The quiet life he had once lived now seemed distant, replaced by a steady rhythm of purpose. Yet, as much as he poured into his work at the center, he couldn't shake the sense that there was more he could do. One afternoon, as Leonard helped Ethan set up a craft station for the younger kids, Dana approached him with a clipboard in hand. "Leonard, I need your help with something," she said. Leonard raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" Dana hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I've been thinking about how much you've done for this place. The kids, the volunteers, even me, we've all learned so much from you. I think it's time we share your story." Leonard frowned slightly. "My story?" Dana nodded. "We're hosting a community event next month, a kind of open house to show people what we're about. I think you should give a talk, share your experiences, the lessons you've learned. You've got a way of connecting with people, Leonard. Your words could make a real impact." Leonard leaned on his cane, his mind turning over the idea. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone sharing the parts of his life he had kept hidden for so long. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'm not much of a speaker." Dana smiled gently. "You don't have to be polished. Just be yourself. That's more than enough." That evening, Leonard sat at his dining table, staring at the blank page of his notebook. The idea of sharing his story felt daunting. His life wasn't one of grand achievements or fame. It was a life of quiet struggles, small victories, and lessons hard-earned. But as he thought about Caleb, Ethan, and even Emily, he realized that his story wasn't just about him. It was about the connections he had made, the lives he had touched, and the power of resilience. Slowly, he began to write. The day of the community event arrived with clear skies and a brisk autumn breeze. The center was bustling with activity tables set up with crafts, snacks, and information about programs. Parents mingled with volunteers, and children darted around with painted faces. Leonard sat in the corner of the main hall, watching the scene unfold. Dana had reserved a spot for his talk toward the end of the event, and he felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. Ethan and Caleb found him sitting there, their expressions curious. You ready for your big speech? Ethan asked, a grin tugging at his lips. Leonard chuckled softly. As ready as I'll ever be. Caleb tilted his head, studying Leonard. What are you even going to talk about? Leonard met his gaze. You'll see. When it was time for Leonard to speak, the room quieted. Dana introduced him warmly, recounting his contributions to the center and the impact he had made. Leonard rose slowly, his cane steadying him as he approached the front of the room. The crowd, parents, volunteers, children, and community members watched expectantly. Leonard took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. I've spent most of my life in the background, he began, his voice steady but soft. I didn't think I had much to offer the world, and I wasn't sure the world had much to offer me. He paused, his gaze settling on Caleb and Ethan, who were seated together near the front. But I've learned something over the past few months. It doesn't matter how small you think your actions are. Kindness has a way of rippling out, touching lives in ways you can't always see. Leonard shifted his weight, his grip on the cane tightening slightly. I used to think strength was about toughness, about enduring hardship, without showing weakness, but I've come to understand that real strength is about connection. It's about reaching out, even when it's uncomfortable or uncertain. He shared pieces of his story, the hardships of war, the guilt he carried for years, and the simple yet profound impact of delivering Henry's letter. He spoke of Caleb's talent, Ethan's transformation, and the sense of community he had found at the center. As he spoke, the room seemed to shrink, the air filled with an almost tangible sense of attention. Leonard's words weren't rehearsed or polished, but they came from a place of truth, and that truth resonated. He ended with a quiet but powerful statement. Every person in this room has the ability to make a difference. It doesn't have to be grand or loud. Sometimes the smallest gestures, listening, encouraging, being present, are what change lives. And in doing so, you might just find your own life changing too. The room erupted into applause, but Leonard didn't bask in it. Instead, he smiled faintly, nodded in acknowledgement, and returned to his seat. After the event, people approached Leonard one by one, thanking him for his words. A young father shared how Leonard's speech had inspired him to spend more time with his children. A high school teacher asked if Leonard would consider speaking to her students. Even Caleb and Ethan seemed moved in their own ways. You didn't tell us you were going to get all deep, Ethan teased, though his grin betrayed his admiration. Yeah, Caleb added, his tone uncharacteristically sincere. That was pretty cool. Leonard smiled at them, his heart full. That night, as Leonard returned home, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. His story, once a private struggle, had become something larger, something that could inspire and guide others. Sitting at his table, Leonard opened his notebook once more. This time, he wrote not just for himself, but for those who might one day read his words. The story he was living was far from over, and for the first time, Leonard was eager to see where it would lead next. The weeks after the community event were some of the busiest Leonard could remember. His words had sparked something within the neighborhood, a quiet movement of people wanting to contribute. New faces began appearing at the center, parents eager to volunteer, local business owners offering resources, and even teenagers looking for ways to help. Dana often joked that Leonard had become a celebrity, but he waved it off with a modest smile. He didn't feel like a hero, he simply felt like a man doing what needed to be done. At the center, Caleb and Ethan were thriving. Caleb had taken on more responsibility, helping younger children with their art projects and even leading a weekly drawing class. Ethan, once a restless presence, had transformed into a leader among the volunteers, his quick wit and steady demeanor earning the kids' trust. One afternoon, as Leonard worked in the tutoring room, Caleb approached him with a serious expression. "Leonard," Caleb said, holding up a flyer, "they're doing an art competition downtown. The theme is Stories of Resilience. I was thinking, maybe I should enter." Leonard's face broke into a wide smile. That's a wonderful idea, Caleb. You've got something worth sharing, and this is a chance to let the world see it. But what if I don't win? Caleb asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Leonard leaned on his cane, his gaze steady. Winning isn't the point. Sharing your story is. And I'll tell you something, courage isn't about being sure you'll succeed. It's about taking the leap anyway. Caleb nodded, his resolve hardening. Okay, I'll do it. Meanwhile, Ethan had taken on a new project of his own. He approached Dana with an idea to start a mentorship program for teenagers like himself, kids who needed guidance but were often overlooked. I just think if someone had talked to me earlier, Ethan explained, maybe I wouldn't have made some of the mistakes I did. Dana was impressed, and with Leonard's encouragement, the program quickly took shape. Ethan became its first mentor, working closely with a handful of younger boys who reminded him of himself. Watching the two boys flourish filled Leonard with a pride he hadn't felt in years. They were proof of what he had come to believe so deeply, that small acts of kindness could ripple out in unexpected and profound ways. One evening, Leonard stopped by the diner. Emily greeted him with her usual warmth, setting down a cup of coffee before taking a seat across from him. "You've been busy," she said with a smile. "Keeping out of trouble," Leonard replied, his tone light. Emily studied him for a moment, her expression turning thoughtful. "You've done so much for the center and for those boys. Do you ever think about what's next?" Leonard chuckled softly. "At my age, I try not to look too far ahead. But lately, I've been thinking about writing more. Not just for myself, but for others. Maybe it's time to put some of these stories into a book." Emily's eyes lit up. "You should. You've got so much to share, Leonard. Your story could inspire people who might never step foot in the center." The idea stayed with him long after he left the diner. The day of Caleb's art competition arrived, and Leonard, Ethan, and Dana all went to support him. The gallery was filled with people of all ages, admiring works that ranged from abstract paintings to detailed sculptures. Caleb's piece was a large pencil drawing of the community center, its windows alive with light and activity. In the foreground, he had sketched a group of figures, a man with a cane standing beside two boys, their postures relaxed and confident. When the judges announced Caleb as the winner of the competition's youth division, Leonard saw tears glisten in the boy's eyes. "See?" Leonard said, patting Caleb on the shoulder. "I told you you've got something worth sharing." Caleb grinned, his usual shyness replaced by a quiet confidence. As the weeks turned into months, the community center became a hub of activity and growth. The mentorship program flourished under Ethan's leadership, and Caleb's success inspired other kids to explore their talents. Leonard continued his work, but he also spent more time writing, filling his notebook with stories of resilience, kindness, and the lessons he had learned. One afternoon, as he sat at his dining table, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Ethan and Caleb standing there, both holding small gifts. "What's this?" Leonard asked, surprised. Ethan held out a framed photo of the three of them standing in front of Caleb's winning artwork. "Just a little something to say thanks for everything." Caleb handed him a sketch pad, its cover embossed with Leonard's initials. "For your writing," he said quietly. Leonard's throat tightened as he accepted the gifts. "Thank you, boys. This means more than you know." That evening, Leonard sat by the window, the city lights twinkling outside. He opened his notebook and began to write the first chapter of his book. He titled it, "Echoes of Kindness." As his pen moved across the page, Leonard felt a deep sense of peace. His life had been a tapestry of struggle and resilience, but in the end, it was the connections he had made that mattered most, and he knew now that his story, and the stories of those he had touched, would continue to ripple out, changing lives in ways he might never see. As Leonard's story reminds us, even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple outward, creating change far beyond what we can see. Every person you meet carries a story, a journey shaped by challenges, triumphs, and the strength to keep moving forward. By offering compassion and understanding, we not only help others grow, but also discover our own purpose and resilience. If this story inspired you, consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of connection and hope. Together, we can spread these lessons and make the world a little kinder. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of the values that truly matter. Join us as we explore tales of resilience, kindness, and the profound impact of human connection. Let's build a community that uplifts and inspires. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.